today we're going to talk about the healthy distrust that is built into our system. And it's a healthy distrust of our government. Now, why? We see it all around us today. We see that corruption today is at an all-time high. Or is it really? Corruption has probably always stayed the same. But now our access to information exposing it has probably been the factor that leads us to believe that corruption is more rampant now than ever before. Now, Julian Assange has his own First Amendment protections. He's not even a citizen of the United States, and yet the United States is treating him like he is a citizen. And he is entitled to his First Amendment protections to be able to release information that is uncomfortable, to say the least, to the United States government. Now, I also have First Amendment protections, and that's why I'm pursuing this investigation of the Tupac and Biggie murders. So what do Julian Assange, Tupac Shakur, and Suge Knight have in common? I'm going to lead you through this today. Julian Assange has been in the Ecuador embassy as a refugee since 2012. He's been a political refugee. Now, Hillary Clinton talked about drone striking him, and we know from Libya that she's serious about killing when she thinks it's necessary. Remember that whole "we came, we saw, he died," and then she laughs about the death of Gaddafi. She laughs about it. She thinks it's hysterical that he got killed the way he did. And, you know, it's not funny when somebody gets killed. It just isn't funny. And even soldiers that have to do killing, you know, when they laugh about it, when they laugh about taking another human's life, that is homicidal, psychotic, sociopathic behavior. And we saw that Hillary has those traits. And one of the things that we learned from Julian Assange was that Bernie had the election stolen from him by Hillary Clinton. That all came out in the emails that were released. Now, we would not have known that if it wasn't for Julian Assange. Now, about a month ago, the chatter began about ending the Julian Assange standoff. And what was the big bargaining chip? Well, we've learned that the IMF has just made huge multi-billion loans to Ecuador. So this is an illegal expulsion that is against the 1951 Conventions on Refugees. But nobody cares that it's illegal. And why don't they care? Because really, there is no constitution in America today. This Constitution really does hang by a thread, and it's the First Amendment that is hanging by a thread. And they've subverted our Constitution. And if you go back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of my dear friends is a very, very high-level Democratic operative. He was at the Democratic National Convention when Hillary, and he's been to a lot of those, and he was the one that put the Trans-Pacific Partnership on my radar screen. I didn't even know about it until he brought it on my radar screen, and nobody could read it. But the whole point of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to basically subvert our Constitution on a formal, official basis so that we would be completely subject to a world order that would control how things happen in our country. But our Constitution has already been subverted because too few people have stood up and demanded the rights that are listed in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. And now there is data that is being stored on every single one of us descenders, and it would be easy to round us all up at the snap of a finger. Okay, they could round us up at any time. And let me just throw this out there for those of you who are students of history. IBM is a great company, right? We look at it today, the stock's doing really well, good people run the company, but there's a shady past to IBM. One of the things that they did was they did a census over in Nazi Germany, and they collected data on who was who in Nazi Germany. So when it came time to round up the Jews and send them off to be exterminated in concentration camps, it was IBM that had provided the data that was used by the Nazis to round up and exterminate the Jews. And now data is being stored on each and every one of us at an alarming rate. And when it comes time to round us up and send us off to the gas chambers, the data is available for them to know exactly who to go and get. And that's why it's important today that we fight against what's happening to Julian Assange, because they don't like when information gets released showing how they operate in secret. And the only way that they can eliminate the threat that Julian Assange is by placing him in custody. And it wasn't too long ago that all of his access was cut off to the outside world. That was right after Donald Trump got elected. So they have nothing on him, but he's been silenced. His indictment is a joke, saying he's trying to help Chelsea Manning. And that's why it was important. Even though Chelsea Manning's, her sentence was commuted, it was important for the Justice Department to go after Chelsea Manning and put her back in prison, because we have to silence her too. Now I'm going to show you a video of why I stand with Julian Assange, and then we're going to get into Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur. I distrust our government, okay? Gary Webb committed suicide with 2 gunshot wounds to his head. Some of you know who Gary Webb is. For those of you who don't know, Gary Webb was known for blowing the whistle and breaking the story about the CIA, a faction of the CIA, putting drugs out on the streets of America to destroy the black family and to raise money for covert activities. And Gary Webb commits suicide with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Now that alone should send alarm bells off. Here's an investigative reporter who has been silenced with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and they rule it a suicide. Okay? Now, is there any corroborating evidence that the CIA tried to destroy black families and put drugs out on the streets of America to raise money for covert activities? Well, Ehrlichman, who was an aide to Nixon, said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And this is one of the top aides to Richard Milhous Nixon, who is saying that they disrupted these families in their communities. They disrupted them because they couldn't reach them, and they couldn't control them any other way. So they came up with a strategy to defeat them in a horrific and horrendous way. And now there's a history of government involvement in drug trafficking. America operated during the Vietnam War and transported opium and heroin to fund covert activities in Laos. And in August of 1996, a story breaks written by Gary Webb that Freeway Ricky Ross had been supplied by a CIA-backed cocaine ring. Now think about how close that is to the Death Row Records story. At the time that Death Row Records was funded, Freeway Ricky Ross and Michael Harry O. Harris were cellmates. And Harry O puts up the $1.5 million to fund Death Row Records. And I actually spoke to the man that delivered the $1.5 million in cash to David Kenner and Suge Knight. And it was delivered in a brown grocery sack. Okay? Crack cocaine was elevating the drug trafficking over what was happening in the Nixon era. There were federal sentencing guidelines that were made to target black men and women, and these were straight up racist laws targeting black families, and the results were devastating. Talk to anybody in the inner cities about crack cocaine, and you'll hear stories of the devastation that this caused. And this wasn't over in some third world country. No, this was in America. This was right here. And exposing this story cost Gary Webb his life. His story was released in August of 1996, and Death Row Records was toppled on September the 7th, 1996. Coincidence? Perhaps, but maybe not. There was a federal drug probe into Death Row Records that was seen as a criminal enterprise, but after tens of millions of dollars spent and probably 1 million man-hours, absolutely nothing came of that probe, in spite of many corrupt cops being involved in that record label. It was all simply swept under the carpet. And the last 2 police chiefs that have been named as the heads of the LAPD both have ties to the Rampart Scandal. They are handpicked because they're going to keep a lid on this Rampart Scandal and stop the truth from bubbling up. But investigative reporters are continuing to dig, and that truth is bubbling up, and I'm investigating it. And so this Julian Assange issue is extremely personal to me, because if they can silence Julian Assange, it's only a matter of time before they silence me. And so that's what this has to do with Julian Assange. He's another journalist like Gary Webb that's put his life on the line to expose secrets that our government would rather we not know about. Okay? So I want to show you one of the things that he exposed, and it's a murder that happens in Iraq. And you can hear the pilots that are orchestrating this murder laughing about the killing. Okay? And the whole thing is reprehensible, but I'll let you watch it for yourself and just think about Hillary Clinton laughing about Gaddafi being murdered at the same time, because it's the same kind of homicidal, psychotic episode. And Julian Assange put his life on the line to bring us this video. Here it is.
And open the courtyard.
Yeah, Roger. I just estimated there's about 20 of them. There's, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that's...
Hey, Bushman, relevant. Copy at White 6. That's a weapon.
Yeah. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
We'll call for exchange by trying my umbrella. Speed 37. Copy at White 6, Bushman 26, Romeo. Roger. Fucking break.
Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Have individuals with weapons.
4 radio. Rio Banners 1-4.
Yep, he's got a weapon too. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Have 5 to 6 individuals with AK-47s. Request permission to engage.
Roger that. We have no personnel east of our position, so you are free to engage over.
Alright, we'll be engaging.
Roger, go ahead. I can't get them now because they're behind that building.
Any Bushman's element? Copy.
We got RPG.
Alright, Alright, we got a guy with an RPG.
I'm gonna fire.
Okay. No, hold on, let's come around.
Behind buildings right now from our point of view.
Yeah, we're gonna come around and get him from
eyes on individual RPG. Getting ready to fire. We won't.
Yeah, we got a guy shooting. Now he's behind the building.
God damn it.
Speed coming around.
Negative. He was right in front of the Brad. About there 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then.
Just fucking, once you get on, just open them up.
Again, Roger. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees out along this.
You're clear.
Alright, firing.
Line here. With the space line. Let me know when you get it.
Won't you? Light them all up.
Come on, fire.
Hey, Roger.
Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
Alright, we just engaged all 8 individuals.
Yeah, we got 2 birds. We're still firing.
Roger.
Got him.
6 is a 2-6. We'll move, but we got this.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I was on gun.
Bypass.
God damn it, Kyle.
Alright. I hit him by heck.
So that video is pretty horrific, and I'm going to include a more extended version for those of you who want to see the extended version of this video, and if you want to look at the whole thing, because subsequent to just the killing that goes on and what have you of these journalists, there is a van that pulls up to render aid, and that van is also attacked. And when the troops show up, they are horrified by what they see, because they were told that every single one of these people had guns, and what they were holding really were cameras. There were 2 journalists that were there that were holding cameras. Those were not guns. And Julian Assange is the one who brought this video to light. He exposed the government silencing 2 journalists that were covering the war. Now, was this a mistake? Possibly it was. But there was a cover-up, and our government was trying to hide this from our view until Julian Assange bravely brought it forward. So without Julian, we would have never learned about this. We would have never learned about Bernie Sanders having the Democratic Party steal the primary election from him. So our government must have checks and balances. And the First Amendment is there to let the people know what our government is doing. And Tupac Shakur was targeted by Dan Quayle, telling America that there's no place in our society for Tupac or for his lyrics. And his voice has now been silenced. And Tupac was bringing us stories from the streets. He was telling mainstream America about what was happening in the inner cities, and that was something that our government didn't want normal citizens to know, and it was coming out in the music. Now, who was sitting next to Tupac when he was shot? Well, that would be Suge Knight. And in 1996, just as the story breaks about the CIA putting drugs out on the streets of America and financing received from Death Row Records that probably came from that cocaine sales that had to do with Gary Webb's story about Freeway Ricky Ross and Michael Harry O'Harris, Suge Knight puts together this record label. And eventually he brings Tupac Shakur to the record label. Now, Suge Knight was subsequently arrested for murder. And if you look at Larger Than Life, the Suge Knight story, and I'll include a link in the notes, you can see that Suge Knight was guilty of murder, but it was justifiable homicide because they were coming after him to kill him with guns. And Suge Knight is given a $25 million bail and eventually gets, lowered to $10 million. But I actually brought somebody to the table that was going to bail out Suge Knight, and so that he could mount a proper defense. And that was a very, very difficult thing, because the way the DA's office had this set up was that anybody who put up the money to bail out Suge Knight was going to have to undergo a complete investigation by the DA's office. And nobody would ever consent to this type of investigation, because if they're investigating a person and not a crime, kind of like they did with Donald Trump recently, right? They were investigating the person. They weren't looking for a crime. They were looking at the person. And they're always going to find something. We'll figure out what's in it with the Mueller report that's about to come out. But my point about Suge Knight is that his record label was stolen from him, and now he was given this huge bail, and there was no contact with the outside world. He wasn't allowed any contact with the outside world. And if you look at 3 people that were involved in his legal defense, one of them being his wife, or common law wife, or girlfriend of many years, however you want to look at that, she was charged with selling the TMZ tape that basically exonerated Suge Knight, and she was given 3 years in prison. And of course, you know, they gave her probation, and then they violated her probation, so she ended up going to prison, and she just recently got out. And then there were 2 attorneys that also tried to help Suge Knight, and they were charged with witness tampering. And now one of those attorneys has caught a federal case for some kind of thing with taking tax returns. Okay? So Suge Knight had no choice, because they had run out the clock on him. And as he was making his plea deal, he asked through somebody that he knows that knows me if I would find him an attorney. And I did find him an attorney. But I have to say, the last 3 or 4 weeks of his, before he entered his plea, this attorney was barred from visiting him. He was told, come on down, you can visit your client. He got there, denied. He was told he had to fill out a form, denied. He filled out the form, now his number gets blocked. His secretary tries to fax it over, that number's blocked. They did everything that they could to deny him. He went to the judge, and he had a meeting with the judge, and the judge said, hey, I can't let you see him. And he said, okay, well, what do I need to do? Well, you need to go over and see the district attorney. He went over and saw the district attorney, and they just denied him. And by then, the clock had run out, and Suge Knight had no attorney to give him a second opinion on his plea deal. And the way the plea deal was entered, it's almost impossible to win this on appeal. It's going to be impossible for Suge Knight to win this on appeal. Every right that was guaranteed to Suge Knight in our Constitution and Bill of Rights was denied to him in his case. And Suge Knight sits in prison right now with a 28-year sentence because of the fact that they do not care about our Constitution. They don't care, and there's not going to be any consequences for anybody that was involved in denying Suge Knight his constitutional rights. So what that tells me is that Julian Assange really doesn't have a shot at a fair trial, because people that are in charge in our government just don't care. And recently, 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, 2 corrupt former cops were arrested on drug trafficking and money laundering charges. Now, these are 2 cops that were involved in the Tupac and Biggie murders, okay? They were involved in the Tupac and Biggie murders, and they have done everything they can to cover up those murders, and they've had help from inside of the LAPD, and Russell Poole filed a suit against the LAPD. calling them on the carpet for obstruction of justice, not just in these two murders, but the entire Rampart Scandal. And the Rampart Scandal flowed through the halls of Death Row Records. And these two corrupt cops, they're former corrupt cops now, were involved in the cover-up. And in fact, the affidavit that's written as the search warrant for the Tupac murder is full of all kinds of holes, and the narrative was steered by these guys, including a fake chain snatch story that gets entered by one of these corrupt cops, and probably both of the corrupt cops, into the narrative about who killed Tupac. And there's an LAPD cover-up that includes a corrupt LAPD cop who is caught in corruption in a case. He's pushed out of LAPD, gets to keep his pension, and he's the one that's come up with the whole story about the cover-up, about how the whole story, and he's the one that's come up with the whole story about what happened in the Tupac and Biggie murders. And the lies, none of them make sense. The truth just has that ring. And it's investigative journalists like Julian Assange. Russell Poole, towards the end of his life, was an investigative reporter, and Gary Webb. There's guys today that are doing it as well. There's George Webb, who's out there, and he's on the front lines pushing out truth. Does he get it right every single time? No, but a lot of what he says is backed up by a lot of facts. And he even says it. He says, look, 95% of what I'm going to tell you is fact. The other 5% is working theory. Now, these two cops that were arrested on drug trafficking and money laundering, there are fingerprints of them in the drug trafficking, money laundering game all the way back through the 80s and 90s. And one of them, a senior detective inside of LAPD, said of one of these cops that he controls the drug trade in Compton. Okay? And because they're former cops, they get special treatment at every single step of the way, including the older one is given a bond that's put up by his brother, and it's interlineated at the bottom that if he violates the terms of this bond, that his brother still gets his money back, which means it's not really a bond. Okay, so they've had every break in the books, and including a plea deal was struck with the younger of the two, and he has been out ever since, and his sentencing date keeps getting pushed off. Okay, so they're getting every single break that they possibly can. And they're involved in the Tupac and Biggie murders. And in fact, there is no difference between Death Row Records and the corrupt Compton Police Department. After Suge Knight goes to prison, they operate as one and the same entity. And we've recently learned from a video that was released about threats that were being made to Eminem and Dr. Dre while Suge Knight was in prison. And everybody blamed that on Suge Knight. But the person that was really behind it, we learned from this video, was Reggie Wright Jr. And this whole thing happened in Hawaii, and we learned about that in a recent video. So Suge Knight was also blamed for putting out Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre's addresses on the internet. But who was running the record label at the time? It was Reggie Wright Jr., one of the corrupt cops that has been arrested on drug trafficking and money laundering charges that was behind it. And now that same cop is asking Jimmy Iovine to pay for his son's college. He wants his kids to be paid for by Jimmy Iovine. And we wonder, is this him asking, or is this him extorting? We don't know. But doesn't it seem strange that somebody is pushing out this kind of information at a time when they're awaiting sentencing? And he gets on live streams and YouTube interviews like he hasn't got a care in the world, which means his judge and the U.S. attorney that's involved in his case must somehow have been gotten to. And we'll know more when we see what kind of sentence he actually gets. If he gets a harsh sentence, we'll know that they're in on it in some way, shape, or form. When Russell and I began looking into these murders, we thought of Death Row Records and Suge Knight as one and the same entity. And a lot of people make that mistake. We came to realize that even though Suge owned all the shares in Death Row Records, that there was a difference between Suge and Death Row, and that there was a coup d'etat that happened inside the record label. Now Reggie is still putting out people's addresses. This is somebody who's waiting sentencing, and he's putting out people's addresses, including my address. Okay, his behavior has not changed. So it's him and not Suge back in the day putting out those addresses, because leopards do not change their spots. Now Reggie said that DeAndre Smith was poisoned and that Greg Kading was the source of that information. And this was on a live stream, and Greg seemed to dodge that, but Reggie confirms it. Reggie doubles down and passes that hot potato into Kading's lap, saying that the info comes from Kading. Kading said, "That's news to me." Reggie said, "No, his girlfriend put rat poisoning in." And these are all actors in the school play, and all of the same people that were there back in '96 at the school play in Las Vegas are there today. Trayvon is there. Trayvon is the one that whispered into Tupac's ear. Trayvon is the one that blocked in Suge Knight so that he couldn't escape the bullets as they fired on him. He had nowhere to go. And Trayvon is the one that comes rushing over to Club 662 after Tupac and Sugar shot, and after Got 'Em is heard come across Reggie Wright Jr.'s radio, and then Don't Say Nothing Over the Radio comes over, a second transmission, and we learned that from Michael Moore, who was standing next to Reggie Wright Jr. at Club 662 when he heard this radio transmission. And then Reggie gets on the radio and shuts down the radios and says, "All right, everybody, turn off your radios." So Michael Moore witnesses this, and now Trayvon, who doesn't have radio contact, instead of going to the hospital where Suge and Tupac are going, he rushes over to Club 662, probably to get further instructions since he had no radio contact. And so what we've learned about the Tupac and Biggie murders could not have been possible if it wasn't for the efforts of Gary Webb, Russell Poole, and Julian Assange. They've all paved the way for us today to continue to investigate dangerous things, murders that involve corrupt LAPD officers, and the LAPD is still trying to cover up the entire ramifications of the Rampart Scandal and LAPD's involvement in Death Row Records. And so now Julian Assange needs our help. Please, please, everybody that's out there, please stand up for investigative journalism. Stand up for the First Amendment. And I want to leave you with a poem that I wrote back as the ramp up happened to the Iraq War, and we were hearing that there were weapons of mass destruction, and of course I thought it was all bullshit. And we were also being told that Al-Qaeda was in Iraq. And of course at the time Al-Qaeda was not in Iraq. but they were after, because there was a rallying cry that was sent out through the Muslim world for all jihadists to head over to Iraq, and that's where we decided we were going to fight. And as I watched this whole parading out of everybody talking about weapons of mass destruction and all this stuff, I wrote a poem, and it's called Elusive Oasis. Elusive Oasis. Deficit spending, national debt, vanishing treasures, age of regret, armies invading, presidents lying, bombs are exploding, soldiers are dying, starving for truth, thirsting for reason, absence of honor in the valueless season, treadmill of progress, where will it lead, decadent structures while refugees bleed, future uncertain, enemy unseen, humanity craves the American dream, salvation of man, future looks bright, hell's frozen tundra reflecting the light, agenda of fear, freedom is hexed, if free speech is dead, democracy's next. Thank you.